A black man walked into a quiet convenience store for a late-night coffee, unaware that within minutes he would be face down on the pavement, accused of being a criminal. The night was calm, the store nearly empty, just a tired cashier and a teenage boy lazily browsing the snack aisle. But outside, 2 police officers sat in their squad car, their eyes locked onto him the moment he stepped inside. The older officer tapped his fingers on the wheel, squinting. "That guy look familiar to you?" His younger partner glanced at the man through the windshield. "Looks like trouble." Minutes later, as the man stepped out of the store, coffee in hand, red and blue lights flashed across his face. Before he could react, strong hands grabbed him, shoving him against the hood of his car. His cup slipped from his grip, crashing to the ground, steaming liquid spreading across the pavement. A knee pressed into his back as the cold weight of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "You match the description of a wanted man," the officer muttered, tightening his grip. The man didn't struggle, didn't fight. He had seen this before. His breath was slow, steady, but his eyes held an unmistakable fire. The officer smirked, convinced he had just caught a dangerous man. But in the next few minutes, everything would change. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. Have you ever seen injustice unfold like this? This wasn't just any man. He was someone the entire country should have been thanking, not humiliating. The pavement was cold beneath him, his chest pressed against the rough concrete, the scent of spilled coffee filling his nose. The officer's knee dug into his back, his breath heavy with unwarranted authority. The man clenched his jaw but remained still. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. But this wasn't where his night had started. Just minutes earlier, he had stepped into a small convenience store, exhausted from a long day. The faint hum of a flickering neon sign buzzed overhead as he pushed open the glass door, triggering the familiar chime of a bell. He adjusted the cuffs of his navy blue suit, scanning the aisles for a simple cup of coffee. The store was nearly empty. Behind the counter, an elderly cashier sat on a stool, eyes glued to the small television playing a late-night talk show. The only other customer, a teenage boy in a hoodie, lazily browsed the snack aisle, popping a piece of gum into his mouth. Outside, the occasional hum of passing cars drifted through the air, adding to the stillness of the quiet night. He moved with quiet confidence, stepping toward the self-serve coffee machine. He reached for a cup, poured himself fresh brew, and stirred in a packet of sugar. His movements were unhurried. This was routine, simple. Nothing about this moment should have felt unusual. But outside, inside a parked squad car, 2 officers were watching. The older officer, a grizzled man with years of patrol experience, tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the store's entrance. He had been on the force long enough to trust his instincts that often aligned with suspicion rather than reason. "He looks out of place," he muttered. His younger partner, still eager to prove himself, followed his gaze. "Or maybe he's just getting coffee," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. He had learned quickly that questioning his superior's gut feeling wasn't always welcomed. The older officer scoffed, tilting his head slightly. "That suit? That car? And he's here at this hour?" The younger one hesitated, but said nothing. He just watched. Inside, the man finished stirring his coffee, pulled out his wallet, and thumbed through a few bills. As he turned toward the counter, his eyes briefly met the teenage boy's. The kid glanced at him, then at the security camera above. A flicker of something passed through the boy's expression: hesitation, curiosity, something else. The man dismissed it. He was used to being watched. Sighing, he set his coffee down on the counter. The cashier barely glanced at him, still fixated on the TV. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp bill. But before he could pay, before the cashier could even acknowledge him, something outside caught his attention. The officers had stepped out of their car. The way they moved was deliberate, practiced. Their hands hovered near their holsters, and their eyes locked onto him through the glass. They didn't have a reason, just a feeling. A hunch. And that hunch was about to change everything. The man barely had time to process the officers approaching as he placed his change on the counter. The cashier, distracted by his television, didn't notice the shift in tension. But the moment the man picked up his coffee and turned toward the door, he saw them. 2 officers standing just outside, their eyes locked on him. His grip tightened around the cup instinctively, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had done nothing wrong. This was just another moment where he had to be careful, measured. He stepped forward, pushing open the door. The night air was crisp, the street nearly silent except for the occasional passing car. He took 2 steps toward his car before a voice stopped him cold. "Where do you think you're going?" The older officer stood directly in his path, feet planted, hand resting dangerously close to his holster. His eyes were sharp, dissecting every movement. The man frowned slightly, keeping his expression neutral. "Home," he said simply. The officer didn't move. Not so fast. The man exhaled quietly, keeping his posture relaxed. "Is there a problem, officer?" The second officer, the younger one, stepped up beside his partner, arms crossed. His gaze flickered between the 2 men, uncertainty laced in his posture. The older officer ignored the question. "We got a report of a suspicious individual in the area," he said. "And you fit the description." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "What description would that be?" The officer's jaw tensed, but he didn't answer right away. The pause said more than words ever could. "Sir, we need to see some ID." The younger officer interjected, his voice firmer than before. The man let out a slow breath. He had been through this before. He knew where it could lead if he wasn't careful. "Sure," he said, voice measured. He reached for his wallet. Slowly, the older officer snapped, his hand moving toward his weapon. The man hesitated just a fraction of a second before continuing, keeping his movements deliberate. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his identification. The older officer snatched it from his hand without a word, glancing at the name. His eyes narrowed. "What's your name?" The man's patience thinned. "It's right there on my ID." The officer's grip on the wallet tightened. "Say it." The man stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. He said his name clearly, firmly. The officer's expression didn't change. He turned to his partner. "Run this." The younger officer hesitated before walking toward the squad car, speaking into his radio. The older officer didn't move. The man watched him carefully. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "What's the problem here?" The officer tilted his head slightly. "You tell me." The tension thickened. A car rolled by, headlights briefly illuminating the scene before disappearing into the night. Inside the convenience store, the teenage boy who had been browsing earlier now stood near the window, phone in hand, recording. Across the street, a woman waiting at the bus stop looked over, her face tense. The younger officer returned holding the wallet loosely. He leaned toward his partner and whispered something. The man caught only a few words. "Nothing on him. Clean record." The older officer's jaw flexed. He nodded slightly but didn't hand back the wallet. Instead, he lifted his chin. "Step over to your car," he ordered. The man didn't move. "Why?" The officer took a step forward. "I said, step over to your car." The man's fingers clenched around his coffee cup before he exhaled, nodding slightly. He turned, taking slow, deliberate steps toward his vehicle. He stopped beside the driver's side door, standing tall. The older officer gestured, hands on the hood. The man blinked. "For what?" The officer scoffed. "Don't play games with me." The man didn't move. "You just checked my ID. My record is clean. What exactly are you accusing me of?" The officer's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance, frustration, something darker. "Just do it," he snapped. The man's patience snapped. "Or what?" The officer's face hardened. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should—" Before he could finish, the older officer grabbed the man's arm. The coffee cup fell, hitting the pavement with a dull splash. The liquid spread, steaming against the cool air. "Stop resisting!" The officer barked, tightening his grip. The man didn't fight back, didn't even pull away, but his voice was sharp. "You're making a mistake." The teenage boy recording murmured under his breath, "Oh, man, this is bad." The woman at the bus stop gasped, her hand covering her mouth. A few more people slowed their steps, glancing over. The street, previously silent, now buzzed with whispers and uncertainty. The younger officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly things had escalated. The older officer, however, was unwavering. "You're coming with us," he said, reaching for his cuffs. The man inhaled deeply, his stance never shifting. Then, for the first time, his expression changed. A flicker of something the officer hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, something else. A quiet certainty. He locked eyes with the officer and spoke in a voice that was steady, unshaken. "Do you know who I am?" The officer froze. His grip tightened, but now there was hesitation in his movements. The younger officer noticed. "What's wrong?" The older one didn't answer. He just stared at the man, at the unwavering way he stood, the way he spoke. Something about this wasn't adding up. A siren blared in the distance. Another police vehicle approached, lights flashing. A superior officer stepped out, face tense, eyes scanning the scene. The moment his gaze landed on the man, his expression changed. Sharp realization flashed across his face, and then he spoke. "What the hell are you doing?" The older officer flinched slightly. "Sir, we have a suspect." The superior officer cut him off. "Let him go, now." The teenage boy's phone was still recording. The woman at the bus stop whispered, "Oh, my God." The man still didn't move, but his words hung in the air, heavy and unshaken. "You're making a mistake." And now, the officer knew it. The street was no longer quiet. The flashing red and blue lights from the approaching squad car reflected off the pavement, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the growing crowd. The man stood tall, his breath steady, his posture unwavering. His eyes never left the officers. "I said, let him go," the superior officer repeated, his voice sharp, cutting through the thick tension in the air. The older officer didn't move at first. His grip remained firm around the man's wrist, as if letting go would somehow mean defeat. His jaw tightened, and for the first time doubt flickered across his face. The man, still restrained, didn't struggle. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, firm, absolute. "I've done nothing wrong." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. His eyes darted between the superior officer and the man, realization settling in. Something was off. He could feel it now, the unease, the mistake unfolding before them. The older officer squared his shoulders. He wasn't backing down. "Sir, I have probable cause. He matches the description of a suspect." The superior officer's face darkened. He took a step closer. "You're lying." The crowd murmured, whispers spreading like wildfire. More people had gathered. The teenager with the phone hadn't stopped recording. The man exhaled slowly. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't angry. "You assume I'm guilty because of how I look?" he said quietly. "But you don't know me." A murmur swept through the onlookers. A woman near the gas station shook her head, whispering, "This is wrong." The older officer's face twisted. His pride was on the line now. His authority, his control, it was slipping, and he felt it. He had to reclaim it. He shoved the man against the car. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "Hands behind your back," the officer ordered, pulling out his cuffs. "You're under arrest." The younger officer flinched. "Sir, wait." The superior officer's voice boomed. "I said stand down." The older officer hesitated, his fingers just inches away from snapping the cuffs onto the man's wrists, but he wasn't quick enough. The superior officer stormed forward, shoving his hand between them. "You just put your hands on a decorated war hero." Silence. Complete silence. The crowd stilled. The teenager recording gasped. The woman at the bus stop covered her mouth. The older officer blinked. What? The superior officer's nostrils flared. "You heard me. Let him go." The older officer froze. His grip loosened. The man, who had remained still this entire time, slowly turned his head. For the first time, the older officer saw it. The calm certainty, the quiet strength. This wasn't an ordinary man. This was someone who had given everything for his country. And now, that same country was treating him like a criminal. The older officer swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of the stares burning into him. The crowd was no longer just an audience. They were witnesses. More people were pulling out their phones. He glanced at the younger officer, searching for backup, but there was none. His partner looked away, arms crossed, no longer willing to defend him. The man finally spoke, his voice even, composed. "I served this country," he said. "I fought for your freedom. And this is how you treat me." The older officer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say. A man near the back of the crowd shouted, "Let him go!" Then another voice, "He didn't do anything." The weight of the moment crushed down on the officer. His hands trembled slightly. The cuffs clinked against each other. Then, with visible hesitation, he lowered them. The superior officer's voice was cold as ice. "You're done here," he told him. The officer stiffened. His mouth parted like he wanted to protest, but then he saw the look in the superior's eyes. This wasn't a request. It was an order. The superior officer turned back to the man. "You okay?" The man took a breath, rolling his shoulders as he steadied himself. "I'm fine." The superior officer nodded, then turned to the older officer, his voice low but deadly. "You just humiliated a man who's done more for this country than you ever will." The older officer's face drained of color. He looked back at the man, his lips parting, but no words came, because what could he say? The man stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of every injustice he had ever faced, he said, "You never even asked who I was." The crowd murmured. The teenage boy's hands trembled around his phone, still recording. The older officer looked at the superior one last time. Then he turned and walked away. No handcuffs, no arrest, no power anymore. And as he left, the crowd parted, their silent judgment heavier than any words. The superior officer turned back to the man. "Do you want to file a complaint?" The man exhaled. He glanced at the crowd, at the teenager still recording, at the strangers who had stood up for him. Then he looked the superior officer in the eye. "No," he said, "I just want to go home." The superior officer gave him a firm nod. "You're free to go." The man turned toward his car, straightening his suit jacket. He took one step forward, then stopped. He looked back at the officer who had tried to arrest him, and with a calm, unwavering stare, he simply said, "Remember this moment." Then, without another word, he left. The teenager let out a shaky breath, lowering his phone. The woman at the bus stop whispered, "Thank God for that, officer." The superior officer watched the man drive away before turning toward the older officer. "You're suspended," he said. The older officer swallowed hard. He gave a stiff nod, then turned, walking toward his own vehicle, his career unraveling with every step. The younger officer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. The superior officer turned to him. "Learn from this." The younger officer nodded slowly. He already had. Some people are guilty the moment they step outside, not because of what they've done, but because of what others assume. But the truth always comes out. And when it does, it changes everything. The superior officer's eyes locked onto the man standing beside the squad car. His posture stiffened, his face shifting from authority to something else, recognition. "Wait," he muttered under his breath, his heartbeat suddenly picking up. His gaze flickered from the neatly pressed navy blue suit to the man's sharp, unwavering expression. His mind raced, trying to place the face that now felt disturbingly familiar. Then it hit him, like a punch to the gut. His breath caught. His posture, once rigid with control, loosened. "I know exactly who this is," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the now silent street. The older officer, still gripping the handcuffs, stiffened. His fingers twitched slightly, still clenched around the cold metal. The younger officer took a slow step back, eyes darting between his superior and the man they had just tried to arrest. The crowd, still lingering, murmured. A few people leaned forward, curiosity replacing confusion. The man, the one at the center of it all, stood silent. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was about to speak for him. The superior officer took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "This man," he said, turning toward his officers, voice low but firm, "isn't a suspect." A hush fell over the bystanders. The older officer frowned, a hint of disbelief creeping into his hardened features. "Then who the hell is he?" The superior officer exhaled sharply. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few quick swipes, he tapped into a search and turned the screen around. A military photo appeared. The same man, standing in full uniform. Medals gleamed across his chest. A war hero. The teenage boy holding his phone gasped, nearly dropping it. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "He's a war hero." The woman at the bus stop covered her mouth. Others in the crowd muttered in shock, their voices carrying through the night. The older officer's face drained of color. He stared at the image, at the stark proof that everything he thought was true had been a lie. The handcuffs in his grasp felt heavier now. He had been so sure, so convinced that he was right. And yet, here he stood, holding cuffs meant for a man who had risked his life for this very country. The younger officer swallowed hard. His hands dropped to his sides, shame creeping into his stance. He had doubted it all along. And now he saw just how badly they had messed up. The superior officer's voice was laced with quiet fury. "You just tried to arrest a man who's done more for this country than either of you ever will." The murmurs grew. People were no longer just watching. They were reacting. "He saved lives," a voice muttered. "This is insane," another whispered. The teenager still had his phone up, still recording, but now his hands shook slightly. This wasn't just another video anymore. This was proof. This was the kind of story that didn't just disappear. The woman from the gas station shook her head, anger now replacing shock. "How many times has this happened to someone who didn't have proof?" she said, her voice sharp. The older officer clenched his jaw, his hands now empty. The handcuffs hung uselessly at his side. For the first time that night, he had nothing to say. The man, who had remained silent through the revelation, finally took a step forward. His shoes barely made a sound against the pavement, but the tension cracked like thunder. He looked at the older officer, the same man who had shoved him against his own car, who had treated him like a criminal without ever asking who he was, and then he spoke. His voice was steady, not angry, not loud, but powerful. "You assumed the worst of me," he said simply. The older officer flinched. The man's eyes held firm, unwavering. "You never even asked who I was." The silence that followed was deafening. The older officer swallowed hard. His jaw clenched, but the fire in his eyes was gone. Because he knew. He knew there was no excuse, no defense. He had already lost. And the world had seen it happen. The superior officer turned to the older one, his patience gone. "Give him his wallet back," he ordered. The older officer hesitated for only a second before reaching into his pocket, pulling out the man's wallet. His hands, usually so steady, trembled. He extended it forward, but the man didn't snatch it. Instead, he took it slowly, deliberately, as if to make sure this moment stayed burned into the officer's memory forever. "Next time," the man said quietly, pocketing his wallet. "Ask before you assume." The older officer looked down. He couldn't meet his eyes. The younger officer exhaled, finally speaking. "I'm sorry," he muttered. The man looked at him, eyes scanning his face. And in those few seconds, the younger officer felt more exposed than he ever had before. But the man didn't say anything, because some lessons had to be lived, not spoken. The superior officer turned toward the crowd. "There's nothing else to see here," he called out. But everyone knew. This wasn't something that would be forgotten. The teenager lowered his phone. But the recording? That would never be erased. The man turned away, walking toward his car. He had no interest in dragging this moment out any longer. He had already won. The superior officer walked over to the older one. His voice dropped so only he could hear. "You're suspended." The older officer nodded stiffly. He had known it was coming. The superior officer didn't wait for a response. He turned back toward his own squad car, giving one last glance at the man they never should have touched. The man opened his car door but paused for just a second. Then, turning his head slightly, he left the officer with one last thought. Remember this moment. Then he stepped inside, shut the door, and drove away, leaving behind a street full of people who would never forget what they had just witnessed. The sound of the car engine faded into the night as the man drove away, leaving behind a street that no longer felt the same. The weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air, thick and suffocating. No one spoke, but no one left either. It was as if the entire world had paused, forcing everyone to process what they had just witnessed. The older officer stood in stunned silence. His face was pale, his posture stiff. He still held the handcuffs in his grip, but they felt useless now, cold metal that never should have left his belt. His confidence, his authority, everything he had relied on for years to maintain control, it was gone. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't before. Doubt. He had been so sure, so convinced, and yet, in a matter of moments, the truth had unraveled everything he thought he knew. The superior officer, his face unreadable but firm, took a slow step toward him. His voice was low, controlled, but unforgiving. "You're going to explain yourself back at the station." The older officer swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but no words came. The superior officer's gaze didn't waver. And after that? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I suggest you rethink how you wear that badge." The crowd still lingered, watching, waiting. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He had been quiet for too long. He had followed orders, let things happen without stepping in. But now, as he stood there, he felt the shame creeping in. His eyes flickered to the superior officer, then to his partner, the man he had looked up to, the man who had just been exposed. He finally spoke. "Sir, I—" But the superior officer cut him off. "Go back to the station, now." The younger officer nodded stiffly and walked toward the squad car. He didn't look back. The man, even after everything that had happened, had left composed. He had not yelled. He had not demanded revenge. He had simply spoken the truth. Standing where the man had just been, the superior officer turned to the older cop, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to respect him for what he's done," he said, voice even. "Just respect him because he's a person." The older officer's throat felt dry. Respect. That was all he had needed to give. The teenager across the street lowered his phone. He had captured everything. His heart was still pounding. He had started recording because he had seen things like this before. But this was different. This was proof. He swallowed, staring at his phone screen, at the paused video. The moment the superior officer had called the man a war hero. He had caught something powerful, something the world needed to see. Inside the gas station, the woman who had been watching from behind the counter shook her head, exhaling. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How many times has this happened?" she murmured. To someone who didn't have proof. She had seen moments like this before. Too many. The only difference? This time someone had a camera. This time the truth was caught. The older officer stood frozen as his superior turned away. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew. He had lost more than a case tonight. He had lost respect. The crowd had seen everything. The people on their phones. They wouldn't forget. His reputation was never going to recover from this. No apology, no excuse would ever erase the fact that he had targeted an innocent man. And now the whole world would know. The superior officer spoke one last time. "Go back to the station," he repeated, his voice devoid of patience. The older officer nodded stiffly, defeated. He turned, walking toward his car. As he opened the door, he hesitated. He looked back at the spot where the man had stood, at the empty pavement, the spilled coffee still staining the ground, and for the first time in his career he questioned himself, his biases, his choices, everything. But it was too late, because the moment had passed, and the world had seen him for what he was. The street returned to silence. The teenager pocketed his phone, still shaken. The woman in the store turned away, letting out one last sigh. And the man was gone. But his dignity, that remained. The street was quiet again. The crowd had dispersed, but the weight of what had happened remained. The teenager with the phone took one last look at his screen before locking it. The video was saved. The truth was documented. No one could erase this. The woman inside the store shook her head as she turned away. This time, justice had been served. But how many others had been in his place without proof? And the officer, the one who had made the mistake. He sat in his squad car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly ahead. He had lost more than just a case tonight. He had lost respect. But the man, the one who had been falsely accused, was gone. Not in cuffs, not in shame. He had left with his head held high, his dignity intact, because respect shouldn't be earned through medals or titles. It should be given, because we are all human. Now, the question is for you. What would you have done if you were in his place? Would you have stayed calm? Would you have fought back? Or would you have simply walked away? Let us know in the comments. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe for more eye-opening stories. These moments matter, and sharing them makes a difference. Until next time, stay aware, stay kind, and stand up for what's right.